This is why you need to have the music before the preacher preaches so that the preacher can worship. It is important to worship. I hate it when I go to churches and sometimes people just sit in the office until it's time for the preacher to go out. I'm like, no, I want to be out there with the people worshiping. Thank you so much, Melanie. Let's thank God for her again. Amen. My very favorite hymn of all time, Great is Thy Faithfulness. And then, For Every Mountain. I learned, pastoring a predominantly white congregation, that there was certain music that I couldn't bring to them. And here's why. It had nothing to do with the style of music. It had everything to do with life experience. Some of them couldn't understand why we might shout or cry when you say, for every mountain, you've brought me over. For every storm, you've brought me through. Because gospel music is music of deliverance and overcoming and seeing God as deliverer and provider in a way that some people simply haven't experienced, or they think they haven't experienced. And so I've learned a lot, worshiping and sharing and pastoring people who are very different than myself, but always coming back to the reality that God is such a very real God, that the gospel of Jesus Christ is one that still has power for the world. And you are here, and we are here to prepare ourselves to take that message to the place where those who make our laws are situated, and to appeal and advocate for those who can't be here, to advocate for those whose voices are often stilled, and to advocate for those whose very votes are even suppressed at times. But thank you for having me here, my dear friend, Reverend Dr. Leslie Copeland-Toon, and I think Reverend Dr. Angelique Walker was the one who first gave me the invitation. So I'm so honored to be here with people who are so committed. I have been filled and inspired just by being in conversation these past couple of days. I look forward to the rest of our time together as we get ready to learn how to do that ask and then go and meet with legislators tomorrow. I am a proud pastor in the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, and I thank God for that tradition, which really raised me up. I became an adult as a disciple. I accepted my call as a disciple. I served church as a disciple. Served higher education as a disciple, and you couldn't have told me that I would be called to lead the disciples, but I'm grateful for this opportunity, and it's such a gift and a privilege to represent that particular group of the people of God, that part of the body of Christ. Well, we've heard this text, and we've been wrestling with it ever since we got here. My good friend Frank Thomas has a wonderful book called How to Preach a Dangerous Sermon. If you haven't read that book, you need to get that book. And he affirmed something within me that I've always tried to do, and that's see what else is there. Where's the message of liberation? Where's the difficulty in the text? Where's the hard stuff that sometimes we think might be a little too easy to overlook? And in this text, a lot of commentaries, if you read them, and if we've had conversations with one another, I was teasing Andrea Walker on Friday for kind of poking into my sermon a little bit. But the man who is at the pool of Bethesda, and whom Jesus asked, do you want to be made whole? Do you want to be healed? We find lots of people who say, well, you see, that was just the problem. He didn't want to be healed. He had been there for 38 years. He had time to get that done. Did he want to be healed? And people say the man didn't even answer Jesus' question. He immediately began to give excuses as to why he couldn't get to the pool. I don't have anybody. I have no man. And so, like a good student of the Bible, I like to go back and look at the historical context. What exactly was the Pool of Bethesda? Archaeologists have uncovered beneath all of the different chapels and basilicas that were built on top of this traditional site, A site that looks very much like the description in the Bible with the 5 pools and the 5 porches and the 5 porticos. There is archaeological evidence that this place did exist. But near it is a pool that has steps, a ritual bath or mikveh. And then there was the healing pool where people would have had to have assistance to get into it. So that lets us know that this was no isolated site. It was a place where many people went. There were able-bodied people who came in and out of that ritual bath to prepare themselves for worship or to make sacrifices, to do what they needed to do to worship Jehovah. And here our friend sits for 38 years and says, I have no one. The King James says, I have no man. My husband and I often use scripture to joke back and forth. We're weird, we know. But we joke with that phrase, I have no man. It's like, well, why didn't you get something done? I have no man. I'm sorry. I have no one. I have no man. But seriously, there are systems and structures in our society that prevent us from getting to the pool. There are barriers to access that keep us from getting to the pool. We like to think that we are the land of the free and the home of the brave. And sadly, we often don't understand the damage that this fiery American individualism does to God's sense of beloved community. Why didn't you pick up your bed and pick yourselves up by the bootstraps, infirm man at the pool of Bethesda? It's often said, how can I pick up my bootstraps when I don't even have shoes? How am I going to get to the places I need to go? What kind of life am I going to live if society has structurally, from generation to generation to generation, impeded me? We're celebrating, or not celebrating, we are marking 400 years since the first Africans were brought to what is now Virginia in 1619. We understand the complicity of some African nations and rulers who sold their own people. There are people in Africa, if you travel to West Africa, sometimes you'll have ceremonies where people say, I'm sorry. We are sorry for the role that our people may have played in the slave trade. But when you have generations of people who were enslaved, taken from their land, brought to a different land, where they didn't own their own bodies, where they didn't control what happened with their families, when they had to nurse other people's babies and neglect their own, when they had to not be able to protect the sanctity of their own bodies, it was illegal to read. I always joke and say that the fact that African Americans are Christians is one of God's great miracles. Because the very gospel that was used as a defense for enslavement, somehow we found, as Dr. Warnock said the other day, we were given the Bible and we were told, slaves, obey your masters, but we heard the stories of Moses and the Exodus from Egypt. We heard the stories where Jesus said, I love you all, where we understood that this Savior who loved us so much that he literally bled and died. And I often get into arguments with people about blood. We don't like to talk about the blood. And in my tradition, we come to that table every week, every time we worship. And we talk about the cup that represents Jesus' shed blood. And yet we sometimes want to keep in our head this vision that's on a lot of church fans where Jesus is very gently draped over the cross. And he has a beautiful loincloth on. And there might be a couple of drops of blood on his forehead. The scourging that Jesus endured, the crucifixion was the most brutal way to kill human beings ever recorded by history. There was a lot of blood. And I always tell the story that slaves were beaten in a similar fashion. You will see pictures of backs just ribboned, scars crisscrossing like lattice work on the back. So if a slave heard that Jesus was bruised for my iniquities, beaten, and by his stripes I'm healed, they didn't need imagery to understand what that might look like. They saw it before them. So blood for my community has a very different kind of concept because we know that blood has been shed. We understand the brutality of the physical sacrifice that Jesus made. So for generation to generation, and then we don't get to go to schools. We don't get to vote. We are commiserating and condemned to sharecropping systems, which is just another form of legalized servitude. My in-laws, my husband's parents, both grew up in Mississippi, the children of sharecroppers. If you ask my mother-in-law, who is now 82, if she wants to go back to Mississippi, there is a steelness that comes into her face. There is a hardness that comes into her eyes. She will tell you what it was like to grow up picking cotton and never having enough money and always owing the man. My father-in-law, I asked him, why did you migrate to Chicago, Dad? He said the man that owned the land that they farmed wanted him to go work for one of his businesses in Jackson, Mississippi. And Dad Owens did not want to do that. He threatened to put his whole family off of the land, to take away their whole sense of livelihood. So my father-in-law hopped a train, went to Chicago, stayed with a friend until he got on his feet, and then sent for his mom, his dad, his brother, and his sister. This is my in-laws we're talking about. This is not slavery in the 1800s. Systems. And then when they moved to Chicago, there were only certain places where they could live. Chicago remains the most segregated city geographically in the country. To this day, they are uncomfortable going north of 47th Street. Systems, structures. Well, why didn't you go downtown and get a job? Why didn't you go to school? I have had no one who will prepare me for school, who will allow me. I was not allowed to go to school. I was not allowed to live in places, even if I could afford a house. I may not have been allowed to live in a decent neighborhood. Redlining, real estate deals, covenants that kept people of color from living in certain places, and it still goes on. It still goes on today. We ask ourselves, why don't they do better? I have no man. There is no one to give voice to the voice that has been taken from me. And where are the people, I ask? Where are all the people in the Bethesda pool? Where were the people who were passing by who could have helped him? Who could have ensured that he had the same opportunity to live the life that they were living? If they were able-bodied and they walked by the Bethesda pool and they believed that when those waters were troubled that healing could take place, why didn't they stop? Why weren't they paying attention to ensure that anyone who needed the stirring, the troubling of the water, had the opportunity to get in? Where are the people? Where are the people who have voice? Where are the able-bodied? Where are those of us who have many different layers of privilege? Where are we? Why aren't we at the pool seeing who needs us? Why aren't we voting in local elections? That's where it all starts. And why aren't we knocking on doors like they used to do? Are you registered? Do you need a ride to the polls? In Chicago, they've just elected their first gay mayor and the first black woman to be mayor of Chicago. I did my undergraduate thesis on the corruption in the Chicago Police Department. So I love living in that place because I've studied it all my life, basically. In the early 70s, Chicago had to enter into a consent decree with the FBI because this is what was happening. They were sending people to police academies, and they were doing psychological testing. They basically were putting the least stable emotional people in high crime districts. So you do poorly on a psychological eval, I'm not going to eliminate you from being on the police force. I'm going to put you over in Cabrini Green, the most infamous public housing, high crime areas I can find. So Chicago has had problems for many, many, many years. There are people running for alderman who wouldn't be elected dog catcher in some cities. And it's because of the corruption in the system of patronage that just about anybody can run for alderman. There are no quality standards, as far as I can see, as to who they will elect. And so when we look at systems like that, people have given up agitating. There's a great deal of apathy in Chicago because people feel they can't make a difference. I had a young man who was a student at Divinity School, young African-American man who went to Morehouse, and he was trying to be a community organizer in Chicago. He wound up managing the campaign in South Carolina for Barack Obama. He took a couple of years off from school to do that. And he would just say, Dean Owens, people in Chicago just don't seem to care. They are so used to not having access, to it not making a difference, that they've given up pretty much. But think what it would mean if we actually had progressive thinking people who could work on the funding of educational systems in Chicago, to work to get the state legislature to fund schools differently so that it doesn't depend on whether or not you live in a high rent district as to whether or not you get money for schools. If I vote locally, I can affect state impacts, and if I can affect state impacts, then I'm choosing who's going to Congress and the Senate. It's all tied together, but if I think I can't speak about these things, if I think that I can't make a difference, I sit by the pool. And there's no one who helps me to get a decent educational system that will prevent the disparity that we currently see in New Trier Township on the North Lake Shore, where kids show up on the first day of school and they get laptops and iPads, and the kids in Harper High School on the south side of Chicago who don't have enough books for primary classes, the kids in New Trier who have an Olympic-sized swimming pool and wonderful health education facilities, and the kids at Harper who have a swimming pool that's empty with cracked plaster lining its basin. Where are our voices? Where are we choosing to speak up? How are we educating people about what it means to vote and why it's necessary to vote? Voter mobilization was at the heart of the civil rights movement in the 1960s, and that was during a time when it could mean your very life if you tried to register to vote. And so instead of saying, well, why aren't they registering? Why aren't they doing? They got up and got on buses and went down to the pool. They went to the pools. They went to help them understand the systems and how to work around the systems. Those of you who are working on the border, who are not just handing out food, but helping people to understand what is the asylum process. We have attorneys and volunteers across many of our churches who are working to go to the pool to help people understand what you do when you see that the waters are troubled, how you get in. Where are the people at the pool? Where are we? How have we decided that we can make a difference for those who don't yet either understand or for so many reasons have been disenfranchised? Dr. Warnock told us about an expungement process that his church had engaged with. We're grateful that our friends in Florida voted that previously convicted felons would indeed retain their franchise and be able to vote. What about education? What are we doing to help prepare people even for job interviews? We're going to be working on the Hill trying to make sure we trouble the waters and stir stuff up and change laws. People have to be ready to strike and be ready to take advantage of opportunities. And we have to be at the pool to position them when the opportunities come. We have to organize at the local level. We have to organize within higher education, within our churches, voting drives at your churches. Black churches register voters all the time. We don't see it as a problem. We attended, the heads of communion attended the Conference of National Black Churches last December, and one of my white colleagues said, "It's amazing how free they are to talk about justice." I was like, this is the only place that black folks controlled for so many generations. This is the foundation of the movement for which we fought for our people. I've never known church to be any other way. My grandfather's church was the headquarters for the local NAACP. My grandfather got death threats. There were people, we were told sometimes to go into the basement of my grandfather's parsonage while he had difficult conversations upstairs with folks. I've always seen the church in action. I've always seen people going to the pool, trying to figure out who needs what. But there's a difference also between just charity and justice, right? So going to the pool, some of us feel good because we're working in the homeless shelters. And that's wonderful. Because people need that short-term human compassion. They need clean places to sleep in. We need food pantries so that people have food when there is food insecurity. But we also need people going to the pool to make sure that we're voting and that the right people can make policies that ensure that we don't get mixed income neighborhoods that are primarily gentrified neighborhoods, that we don't tear down public housing and move people to the outer ring of the city where there is no transportation, where they can't get to jobs. We need all of that. It is not enough to make sure they're comfortable at the side of the pool. It's not enough to make sure, is your mat comfy today? Do you need an extra pillow? You want some more food? We're so glad you're here. God bless you. We're praying for you. And then when it comes time to vote, so that our friend at the pool might get a living wage, we're not so sure about that because that might have impacts on our businesses and our profits. We're not so sure about whether or not we want affordable housing mixed in our neighborhoods. Not in my backyard. If you were to travel to the area in Chicago that used to be Cabrini Green, it was supposed to be a mixed income neighborhood. It is one of the most affluent neighborhoods in the city now. And people who can't afford transportation into the city are stuck in what they call the collar counties with no jobs and no transportation. Where are the people at the pool? Where are the people who care enough to ensure that these systems of access that bar access are dismantled carefully, methodically, and justly? The people of God, if we believe that we can trouble the water for the healing of the world, we have to show up at all these pools. Yeah. There's enough pools for all of us to go to. Enough pools for all of us to go to. Enough issues for all of us to agitate about. Enough fights for all of us to wage. Enough wars for all of us to enlist. There is enough work for all of us to do, but we can't sit back simply and blame the people who are at the side of the pool. Because it is quite honestly not their fault that the barriers exist. And generational trauma, we are learning, David Alexander Hooker is helping some of us to learn about the impact of racism and other oppressive structures, that it is trauma. There were a couple of twins who used to attend my home church, Light of the World Christian Church. They were about 14 or 15. They started attending the church because one of them was dating a young lady who attended the church. My husband was the minister of music. After school, they would come by and just hang out. One of them is a drummer. The other one is a graphic artist. Walter used to keep a big jar of Starlight mints in his office. He started noticing that the mints were disappearing faster than usual. He discovered one day in the backpack of one of the kids, it fell over. Huge pile of Starlight mints fell out. Why are they stealing the mints? Walter was a little concerned, but Walter's a gentle guy. And so he's like, dudes, what's up with taking the mints? As it turns out, their mother had basically abandoned them in an apartment to go and live with her girlfriend. They didn't have food at home. Why are they doing this? Why are they doing that? What's happening? What are the systems that are perpetuating desperation? What are the systems, if you don't have food and I watch TV and I see you having all the gym shoes and all the cool clothes and the cars and I don't have it here and somebody shows me a way to get it even illegally? Without certain kinds of information and provision, I take what I can to get what I want. Because you have it, and why shouldn't I? Those young men basically moved in with us. And they got meals. We became their guardians for a period of time. They both went to college. One is a graphic artist, owns his own business. The other does real estate in Indianapolis. We could have said, why aren't you eating? Why aren't you going to school? What they needed was someone to help them learn the language. Someone to help them over the barriers of poverty, of not having enough food, of not having a parent who cared about them getting an education. They learned to do chores in our house. They learned to do homework. It wasn't just about the Starlight mints. We can teach that there's responsibility and that there are individual responsibilities and accountabilities, but unless we break through the systems that keep people paralyzed at the side of the pool, they have no hope, no opportunity to do better. And our systems must be dismantled. As you prepare to go to the Hill, ask yourselves as you do this work, wherever you're coming from, where are the people? Go find some more people. Dr. King, in this wonderful quote that Andrea Alexander brought to our attention yesterday, and I'm going to leave you with this. He says, our nettlesome task is to discover how to organize our strength into compelling power so that government cannot elude our demands. We must develop from strength a situation in which the government finds it wise and prudent to collaborate with us. It would be the height of naivete to wait passively at the side of the pool, I say, until the administration had somehow been infused with such blessings of goodwill that it implored us for our programs. The first course is grounded in mature realism. The other is childish fantasy. So where are the people who are going to break down the systems that are keeping people from the healing waters? And what are you going to do to organize and mobilize those people? I have no one is not a cry of irresponsibility. When someone says, I have no one, look beyond what they're saying to see what systems are impacting their view, their perspective on what's happening. People who don't have access for generation after generation after generation, at a certain point, are not even able to see. And so we have to break down those barriers. Break every chain, the gospel song says. Break the barriers, but we have to show up. So I invite you to show up. Tomorrow, whatever you have to say, wherever you have to go, remember that there are people who need these systems to be broken and dismantled so that they can live lives of dignity, and honesty and integrity and power. And so that they too cannot be able to pay us back. That's not even what it's about. But it's about being able to pass it on. It's about being able to leave a legacy for our children and our grandchildren, that they will not see the same kind of systems and structures clouding their mental skies, as Dr. King said. Where are the people? Will you be one? Will you gather other people? Where are the people? You are needed. Amen.